In the summer of 1969, Central America was a region simmering with tension. The small nations of Honduras and El Salvador, neighbors with intertwined histories, had been grappling with unresolved issues for decades. These issues were not just political, they were social, economic, and deeply human. El Salvador, a country small in size but large in population, faced severe land shortages. Farmers and rural communities struggled to sustain themselves. With limited opportunities at home, hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans migrated to neighboring Honduras in search of work and farmland. By the late 1960s, it is estimated that over 300,000 Salvadorans were living and working in Honduras, mostly in the fertile northern regions. They tilled land, built homes, and sought a future. Yet their presence caused friction. Many Honduran citizens felt that their land and livelihoods were being encroached upon. Local farmers feared competition for jobs, and resentment grew steadily. Politicians in both countries took advantage of these tensions, using nationalist rhetoric to fuel public anger. Newspapers carried inflammatory headlines, painting Salvadorans as invaders and Hondurans as victims. In both countries, citizens were swept up in stories of perceived injustice, stories that created fertile ground for conflict. The resentment was quiet, simmering beneath the surface, until a catalyst arrived: football. The 1970 FIFA World Cup qualifiers drew Honduras and El Salvador into a sporting contest, one that neither nation would ever forget. A simple game intended to determine which team would advance to the World Cup became the flashpoint for an already volatile region. The first leg of the match was held in Tegucigalpa, the capital of Honduras. In the days leading up to the game, the Salvadoran team faced harassment. Local fans surrounded their hotel, shouting insults, banging drums, and setting off fireworks. Sleep was impossible. The team went onto the pitch exhausted, anxious, and aware of the tension surrounding them. Honduras won the first match 1-0. While on the surface, it was a sporting victory. In El Salvador, the loss became a national trauma. News spread quickly, and reports emerged that a young Salvadoran girl had committed suicide following the defeat. Her death was sensationalized in newspapers, transforming her into a symbol of national humiliation. Emotions erupted. The match became more than a game. It became a matter of national pride, identity, and honor. The second match took place in San Salvador, the capital of El Salvador. The Honduran team, entering a hostile environment, faced threats, stones thrown at their hotel, and flags burned. Violence in the streets greeted them. The Salvadoran team, emboldened by national anger, played with intensity and aggression. El Salvador won decisively, 3-0. Celebrations were immediate and widespread, but the jubilation came with a darker side. Honduras nationals in El Salvador were attacked, and reports of harassment and violence circulated. Across the border, Salvadoran migrants in Honduras faced reprisals and eviction. Political leaders in both countries exploited these incidents. The football matches had provided the spark, but the fire of war had been smoldering for years. It was not the goals on the field that mattered most. It was the underlying grievances that the goals illuminated. The third and decisive match was scheduled in neutral Mexico City. This playoff was intended to resolve the qualifier. The Azteca Stadium was filled with anxious fans, journalists, and officials from both countries. El Salvador emerged victorious, winning 3-2 in extra time. National celebrations erupted immediately. Streets filled with cheering citizens, flags waved, fireworks exploded in the night sky. Yet amid the celebration, the El Salvadoran government made a shocking announcement. Diplomatic relations with Honduras were severed. A football match had become the official justification for political rupture. Moments later, cross-border skirmishes began. Salvadoran aircraft bombed Honduran military bases and strategic installations. Honduran forces retaliated with artillery and airstrikes. Soldiers crossed into disputed territories. Villages along the border became battlefields. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. Families fled, leaving homes, fields, and belongings behind. The conflict, ignited by sport, had turned deadly. The war lasted only 100 hours, yet in that brief period, thousands were killed. Most of the victims were civilians. Houses were destroyed. Infrastructure crumbled. Over 300,000 Salvadorans fled Honduras, many never returning home. The brevity of the conflict contrasted sharply with its severity. Outdated aircraft and weapons were deployed, many relics from World War II. Dogfights raged over the countryside. Ground battles were chaotic and uncoordinated. International observers watched in disbelief. It was a modern war initiated by nationalism, fueled by migration disputes, and sparked by a game. Diplomatic intervention by the Organization of American States forced a ceasefire. Both nations agreed to withdraw forces. Borders were monitored, and the immediate violence ended. Yet the underlying tensions remained unresolved. Land disputes persisted. Migrant populations faced discrimination and displacement. Political grievances continued. The football war, though brief, left an indelible mark on both nations. Historians have long debated the causes of the conflict. Football was not the cause, only the catalyst. The true origins of the war lay in economic scarcity, unequal land distribution, migration tensions, and political manipulation. Nationalism amplified these issues, transforming everyday grievances into matters of life and death. Football served as the visible trigger, the moment when decades of unresolved tension erupted in the open. The matches became symbolic battles, representing pride, resentment, and historical injustice. The football war demonstrates how minor events can escalate into major conflicts when societies are already burdened with social, political, and economic tension. The 1969 conflict stands as one of the clearest examples of how national identity, media influence, and historical grievances can converge in deadly ways. It also serves as a lesson in the fragility of peace, the consequences of unaddressed inequality, and the human cost of political opportunism. Even decades later, the football war continues to influence Central American relations. Borders remain monitored. Migration policies are informed by the lessons of 1969. Academic research examines the intersection of sport, nationalism, and conflict. The memory of the war serves as a reminder of how easily pride and politics can turn symbolic events into real violence. The football war is remembered not for the matches themselves, but for the human consequences. 6,000 people lost their lives. Tens of thousands were displaced, and entire communities were forever changed. Football had lit the fire, but the underlying fuel had been accumulating for decades. The war ended after 100 hours, yet its impact continues in the collective memory of El Salvador and Honduras. It remains one of history's strangest examples of how sports, politics, and nationalism can collide. A 90-minute match became a 100-hour war. A game meant for unity and competition became a tragedy defined by human suffering. The football war stands as a cautionary tale. When underlying grievances are ignored and emotions are inflamed, even the smallest spark can ignite catastrophe. The story endures, taught in schools, written in history books, and discussed in academic circles. Football is no longer just a game. It is a symbol, a reminder, and a warning. The 1969 conflict illustrates the fragility of peace, the dangers of nationalism, and the consequences of unresolved social and economic tension. The matches are remembered, but the lessons are deeper. Human societies must address their inequalities, manage migration and resources carefully, and resist letting emotions overpower reason. The football war shows that wars are rarely spontaneous. They are the culmination of years of tension, mistrust, and unresolved issues. Football only gave the world a way to see it. The matches became historic not because of the goals scored, but because of the lives affected. They revealed the vulnerability of societies to emotion, rhetoric, and symbolism. Even today, the borders of El Salvador and Honduras bear the echoes of 1969. Families still remember the evacuations. Politicians still invoke the lessons of the war when debating migration or land reform. Sports historians reference the matches as examples of how symbolic events can have real-world consequences. The football war remains a unique episode in world history, brief, intense, absurd, and tragic. The aftermath of the conflict reshaped daily life across both nations. Villages near the border that once shared trade, marriages, and cultural traditions found themselves divided by mistrust. Farmers who had crossed freely to sell crops now faced armed patrols and checkpoints. Families separated by the border suddenly needed documents, permissions, and escorts to see relatives who had lived just a few hours away. What had been fluid became rigid. What had been familiar became dangerous. The echoes of artillery and the memories of burning fields lingered long after the ceasefire. Children born years after the conflict grew up hearing stories of the 100-Hour War, learning how a football match had become the spark for one of the most unusual wars in modern history. The Organization of American States continued diplomatic efforts in the years that followed. Representatives held meetings, negotiated settlement terms, and attempted to address the underlying issues that had fueled the war. Yet the land disputes remained unresolved for more than a decade. The contested border territories, especially the region near the Rio Guascoran, became points of continued disagreement. Local residents lived in uncertainty, unsure whether their homes would be recognized by one government or the other. Property lines blurred, maps were redrawn and challenged. The war had stopped, but the conflict had not entirely ended. Migration policy became a central issue across Central America. The expulsion of Salvadoran migrants from Honduras destabilized families and economies. Many returned to Salvador with nothing but clothes and memories of the farms they had lost. Their children were forced into overcrowded schools. Their parents were left to find new work in a country already suffering from land shortages. Communities in El Salvador struggled to absorb the influx. The returning migrants carried stories of violence, harassment, and forced eviction. These stories added to the growing unrest in El Salvador, feeding a sense of injustice that would later play a role in the civil conflict of the 1980s. The football war was not a single chapter in the region's history. It became part of a chain of events that shaped decades of instability. In Honduras, the war became tied to national identity. Victories on the battlefield were celebrated, and the narrative framed Honduras as a nation defending its territory and sovereignty. Textbooks emphasized heroism. Schools taught the importance of protecting the homeland. Politicians invoked the war when appealing to nationalist sentiment. For many Hondurans, the conflict became a symbol of resistance against foreign influence. Yet beneath the public narrative, rural communities continued to grapple with poverty, land disputes, and economic challenges. The war had offered a brief sense of unity, but it did not resolve the problems that had existed before it began. For El Salvador, the war became a symbol of sacrifice. The country mourned the civilians lost, the families displaced, and the soldiers who fought in a conflict born from desperation and pride. Stories of bravery circulated through rural villages. Families told tales of men who fought with limited supplies and outdated weaponry, facing odds that seemed impossible. The war deepened the sense of national unity, but it also highlighted the fragility of the country's political and economic system. Like Honduras, El Salvador faced the same questions it had before the conflict: land inequality, poverty, and a growing population with limited opportunities. The war had not solved these issues, it had only made them harder to ignore. In both countries, journalists and historians looked back on the match that sparked the conflict. They analyzed how sport events can amplify national emotion. They examined the power of media in shaping public opinion. Newspapers had played a critical role in escalating tensions, publishing sensational headlines, stirring anger, and framing the matches as national battles. The public, already frustrated by years of inequality, reacted to the stories with intensity. The media became a participant in the conflict, adding fuel to an already dangerous fire. Researchers later argued that the football war demonstrated how a narrative can matter as much as a policy. The way a story is told can unite a nation or divide it. In 1969, the story became a weapon. Football analysts around the world studied the match itself. The rivalry between Honduras and El Salvador grew legendary. Commentators used the matches as examples of how sport can transcend the field and influence geopolitics. The players, many of whom had no desire to be symbols of nationalism, found themselves at the center of a conflict they could not control. Years later, interviews with players revealed their shock at how a simple qualifier had escalated into war. Some expressed guilt, others expressed confusion. None had expected their careers to be tied to history. The weight of the conflict followed them long after they retired. International organizations examined the conflict as a case study in escalation. The war became a lesson in crisis management, showing how small events can spiral when underlying issues are ignored. Scholars pointed out that the football war was not caused by football. It was caused by decades of political neglect, economic disparity, and social tension. The matches simply exposed the truth. A nation that struggles to feed its people can be ignited by emotion. A society burdened by poverty can be turned toward conflict. A government unable to resolve domestic disputes can use nationalism to rally support. The football war became an example taught in military academies, political science courses, and conflict resolution seminars around the world. The long-term impact of the war extended far beyond 1969. For years, Honduras and El Salvador remained suspicious neighbors. Diplomatic relations, once severed, were slow to rebuild. Trade agreements were delayed. Border cooperation remained fragile. Large stretches of the border remained demilitarized to prevent further conflict. Even after treaties were signed, the scars remained visible in the landscape. Burnt-out buildings, trenches, and abandoned villages stood as reminders. Grass grew over former battlefields, but the memories persisted. Oral histories recorded from villagers painted a vivid picture of fear, loss, and displacement. Children who lived through the conflict grew up to adults with stories etched into memory. Their recollections formed the emotional backbone of the historical record. As decades passed, both nations evolved. Political landscapes changed. Leaders were replaced. Economic reforms were attempted. Central America faced new challenges. Yet the memory of 1969 stayed present. Projects designed to promote regional unity referenced the war as an example of what must never happen again. Football federations in both countries emphasized fair play, respect, and international cooperation. Matches between Honduras and El Salvador were carefully monitored. Security protocols were redesigned to prevent the kind of crowd behavior that had contributed to the conflict decades earlier. Though the passion for football remained high, both nations learned to separate the game from political sentiment. The football war also influenced global perceptions of Central America. The conflict was covered extensively by international media. Headlines framed it as a bizarre and almost unbelievable event. The idea that a football match could spark a war fascinated audiences around the world. Documentaries were produced, books were written, academics debated its causes and implications. The conflict became a symbol of how delicate political stability can be. It showed that even seemingly trivial events can have profound consequences when the environment is ripe for conflict. Many commentators use the war to argue that governments must address deep structural issues before they explode. The football war became a global metaphor for the cost of neglect. Generations later, young people in both nations viewed the conflict through the lens of history rather than experience. Schools taught the events of 1969 as part of national history. Lessons emphasized the importance of diplomacy, cooperation, and peace. Teachers encouraged students to understand how small events can escalate when fueled by emotion and misinformation. The goal was not to forget the war, but to learn from it. Teachers used stories from survivors to show the human cost of conflict. In classrooms, students listened to elderly residents describe the fear of airstrikes, the chaos of evacuation, and the uncertainty of war. These stories served as living reminders of why peace must be protected. Despite the tragedy, the football war also produced moments of humanity. Stories emerged of soldiers helping civilians escape danger, families hiding neighbors from rival countries, journalists protecting sources, doctors treating wounded citizens from both sides. These acts of compassion revealed that even in the midst of conflict, humanity endures. War showed the worst of human behavior, but it also revealed the best. These stories became part of the historical narrative, serving as reminders that conflict does not erase empathy. The football war remains one of the most unique conflicts in modern history. It did not begin with ideology. It did not begin with a struggle for resources. It did not begin with political assassinations or territorial ambitions. It began with emotion. Football served as the visible trigger, but the root causes were deeper and more complex. The conflict demonstrated how powerful national pride can be. It showed how quickly anger can turn into violence when fueled by propaganda and political opportunism. Above all, it revealed the consequences of ignoring social and economic inequality. Today, the football war is studied not only as a historical event, but as a warning.
The conflict reminds the world that peace is fragile. When nations neglect their people, ignore inequities, or manipulate public emotion, the risk of conflict rises. The football war teaches that small sparks can ignite large fires. It urges societies to address underlying tensions before they erupt. It stands as evidence that the intersection of sports and politics can be volatile. Football may unite nations, but in rare circumstances, it can expose fault lines too deep to ignore. The 100-hour conflict continues to shape the identity of Central America. Honduras and El Salvador have worked to rebuild relations, promote cooperation, and create a shared future. The memory of the conflict acts as motivation. Citizens push for diplomacy. Leaders emphasize unity. Regional organizations advocate for stability. The lessons of 1969